Okay, now let's talk about period. And before I get into graphing while changing the period, let's look at how the number in front of x affects our graph. Okay, so this is just y or f of x equals the sine of x. So we see 6.28, all right, that's equal to 2 pi, 2 times 3.14. All right, we see that this is one full cycle of our graph, from where the graph starts at the origin to this point. Okay, that's because we know from the unit circle, all right, if you plug 0, 90, 180, 270, 360 into the sine of x for x, once you get to 360, since 360 is coterminal to 0, now it restarts the period. So like the same point that you get for x is the same value that you get for 0. And it would be, if you added another period, so like 4 pi, we would also see that same point. So if I did trace, graph trace, and then did 4 pi, you would see that, okay, it's just another, so it's 1 period, 2 periods, all right, because every 360 degrees you get a new set of coterminal angles. All right, now let's look at what happens if we were to graph the sine of 2x. All right, now this looks like the graph completes 2 periods for every 1 period that sine completes. All right, and if we think about it, if we think of, all right, from 0 to 360 are one set of angles, and every angle after that is coterminal to that set, then if we think of the sine of 2x, well, when we plug in pi, so if I go menu, trace, graph trace, and then plug in just pi, we see that is where the red graph finishes one full period. So whereas we plug in 2 pi into the sine of x to get the, sorry, I got cut off there, but what I was saying was if we plug in 2 pi into the sine of x, that'll give us the sine of x equals 0. Whereas for the sine of 2x, we just have to plug in pi to get that same y value, because whatever we plug in is getting doubled before we take the sine of it. So like, in other words, for the blue graph, we plug in 2 pi to get the sine of 2 pi. For sine, all we have to do is plug in pi to get the sine of 2 pi. So that's only 180 degrees. So that's why it's half the size of the blue graph. All right. Now that's kind of the gist of it to help you understand why. But all you need to know is that period is equal to 2 pi divided by b. So if you want to find your period, you just take 2 pi and divide it by the number in front of x. So that's why the red graph has a period of pi and the blue graph has a period of 2 pi. And 2 pi just represents 360 degrees, which is one full circle. So if you think of a unit circle, that kind of makes sense. Okay, now let's use that to graph 2 times the sine of 2x minus 1. Alright, so let's first set up our y-axis. So we're going to have a sinusoidal axis at y equals -1. Alright, since the amplitude is 2, we're going to go up 2 from -1 and down 2 from -1 for our max and our min. Okay, now to set up our x-axis, we have to find our period. Alright, so period is equal to 2 pi over b. So 2 pi divided by 2 gives us a period of pi. Okay, now that's the period, so that's going to be like one full cycle of all our values. But the increment is always going to be 1/4 of our period. So take the period divided by 4, and that tells us like how our interval on our x-axis. So we just keep adding pi over 4. So pi over 4, and then 2 pi over 4 simplifies to pi over 2. Alright, 3 pi over 4, and then 4 pi over 4 simplifies to pi, and these 4 intervals is where we're going to graph our period. So our x-axis is set up, our y-axis is set up, now we just plot points. Alright, since this is sine, we're going to start on the sinusoidal axis, and since it's not reflected, we're going to go up, back to the axis, down, and then back to where we started. And that would be what the graph of example 4 would look like. Okay, let's look at example 5. Y equals the cosine of pi x over 4. Okay, so in this case, if we had like y equals the cosine of bx, okay, in this case, we could rewrite it like this, where b is going to be pi over 4. So when I'm looking for my period, I'm going to do 2 pi divided by pi over 4, which is 2 pi times 4 over pi, which is just going to be 8. Okay, so that's going to be our period. So we're going to now divide that by 4 to find our increment, because you could think of like the 4 quadrants on the unit circle. Like for every 360 degrees, there's 4, like 90, 180, 270, and then back to 360. Like 4 good angles you want to graph, because those quadrantal angles is where you get those nice points like 0, 1, and -1. And then so that allows you to sketch that by hand. So we got 2, 4, 6. So our x-axis is set up, right, and our y-axis is going to be pretty basic because there's no shift and there's no amplitude change. All right, so now we're ready to go. Now notice when pi is in B, okay, notice how there's no pi, or your intervals are not in terms of pi. All right, that's because right here these pi's canceled out. So if B has pi in it, the numbers on your x-axis shouldn't have pi in it. And if B doesn't have pi in it, like in the previous example, then your intervals are going to be in terms of pi. All right, so now let's graph. So it's cosine, so we start at the max, middle, min, middle, and then back to the max. Okay, connect the dots, and that is our graph of y equals the cosine of pi x over 4.